All right, welcome everyone to this session of Map Time Davis. My name is Michelle Tobias. I am the Geospatial Data Specialist at UC Davis Data Lab. I'm really excited today to get to learn a topic that is new for me, and I think new for a lot of folks on the call today. Carlos Barahona and Karen Beardsley are going to tell us about using webhooks for GIS, in particular in the Esri environment. So I am super excited to have them join us today and share this lesson with us. So I think with that, I will turn it over to you both and let you take it away.
All right, thanks, Michelle. Can somebody confirm that you guys can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So today's topic is what webhooks for WebGIS. Basically, I'm just going to preempt it and say like there's some short prerequisites for today, but they're not hard prerequisites. The idea just being that you will have some familiarity with ArcGIS Online. If you're part of UC Davis, you should already have access. So yeah, make sure that you have an ArcGIS Online account with Survey 123. Again, if you're part of UC Davis, it's already done. And then the examples that we're going to provide here are actually using a platform within Office 365 called Power Automate. And I changed names a few times. You might know it as Microsoft Flow. But these are really concepts that are not specific to any one technology. So while we're providing these examples in these platforms, they should be applicable to a lot of other like integration brokers, things like that, but the examples themselves will be with that. So hopefully you can sign up for that if you have not already. But these should both be available as part of UC Davis licenses already. So that's my quick prereq. I assume that some of you already know me, but a brief introduction to me, just kind of to give you context. My name is Carlos Barahona. I put my pronunciation in there, like just it's not a very common name, but the main thing for my name is leave out the H basically. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. My education background, I did my undergraduate here at UC Davis in computer science, but most of my professional career has actually been IT. So between probably about 14 years at this point, it's somewhere in IT, mostly at UC Davis, a little bit outside of that, with a 4-year break in between, somewhere like 7 years at that, where I was a research application developer. I was doing data science, but mostly web development. So part of this talk today is really being able to take concepts that I learned in web application development and apply them once I got involved with GIS. So I have a kind of like non-traditional background in GIS. Like, well, I've been supporting GIS as part of my IT career somewhere since like 2017, 2016. I really like learned it as an additional tool for part of the data science stuff I had done before. So this really kind of, my background is really more in that the idea of modern GIS, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So modern GIS is kind of the intersection between like the traditional GIS, desktop application cartography mixed with data science, and a really big emphasis on web services. So that kind of like was this intersection of all the background that I've had in IT and data science in the past. So I mentioned modern GIS. Modern GIS, again, is that like the idea of connecting GIS fundamentals, taking like the normal GIS analysis and focusing on integrating it with other modern technologies. This is really like tends to have this focus on like things being cloud processed, things being very accessible, so web accessible or mobile accessible first. It has a lot of emphasis on processing in real time, integration with machine learning, AI. Really think of this like, I'm going to give an example, basically like traffic routing. Like think you have your Mapbox, your Mapbox web application that also includes like real-time traffic, might include some type of remote sensors like input from cell phones or like other traffic sensors. So you take something like that and you throw them like, okay, quickly identifying traffic slowdowns might be able to feed into an ML model that can now on the fly identify an accident before it's actually reported and reroute your destination based in your GPS mobile phone application. This is just trying to be like a very everyday real example of the concept of modern GIS. But really, like a lot of the tools in that stack are a lot more accessible than we think. Like it doesn't have to be all one platform. The idea is being able to tie in lots of different platforms and have it all be connected and like pass information between all of this. So today we're specifically talking about webhooks, but this is the key part of that is that real-time processing. Traditionally, in order to do real-time or pseudo real-time processing, your options are basically polling or something like webhooks or like event-triggered processing. Polling that is, again, the more traditional way is like you're essentially like as the programmatic interface, you're querying a data source and seeing, did something change? No. Did something change? No. And it's just like repeatedly checking a resource for updates or changes, or I mean, like additions, deletes, things like that. So in the case of GIS, this might be, or at least ArcGIS, this might be like querying a feature service or a map service to see if anything's been added, deleted, changed. The main disadvantage of polling is that it can put a big strain on server. It might put a strain on bandwidth if we're talking about like mobile applications or things where like there might be bandwidth concerns. Most of the traffic here is telling you nothing. So you're spending a lot of time and server CPU cycles to get nothing done. So this can really result in like latency, decreased performance, but it's a lot easier to do without support from the platform itself, because as long as you have an API, you can make those calls and handle all the logic in your programmatic interface. Webhooks as an alternative, I mean, really webhooks are a web technology or web development technique. It's used generally to integrate multiple web applications. The concept being you hook a process. So you hook some like processing event and you register a place that you want to deliver that event to. So it's an idea of getting notified exactly or pseudo exactly when a resource changes. So with webhooks, the server sends a payload with the information that changed, ideally, when a specific event occurs. So again, in the GIS application, this might involve sending a payload when a feature changes or when a record is inserted. The main advantage for webhooks is that it reduces the server load and it is really much closer to real time. So it means like you can operate on lower bandwidth and lower processing requirements, which ideally leads to like faster response times and a better user experience. What I want to point out is that, I'm like, do I have a little cursor here? Okay. Really, the applications, like the platform itself, unless it's open source, I mean, which like a lot of this is based on open source information, but like our technology, but unless you're controlling the service, even if it's open source, you don't have a lot of control on how the service is providing you access. So with polling, I can just say like, is there information, and I handle all the logic in the API side. Webhooks need platform support because I'm going to tell it I'm registering this, like this event. Now you have to do something and tell me when something happens. So it's really only as good as the platform provides. Luckily, again, like this is becoming more of an like widely supported web technology. Most software as a services provides some concept of webhooks. So it is usually there, but it might not cover all the events that you're interested in. So there's the big caveat of webhooks. I think that's all I have here. And a quick overview again of how webhooks tend to work. You have something, a web service. In this case, we're going to talk about ArcGIS Online. You will have some type of input. This might be like remote sensors, user data submission, something like that. But you register an event and a triggering event in a process. So when the input happens, it goes into a process, and it says like, okay, did it meet this criteria of a feature record update? Now that it's triggered that event, that we're now sending it to a listener application. So the key part being there's two sides of this. There's the webhook itself and a listening service that exists in the application you're attempting to interface or integrate with. Note that there's not really any response here. Like, we're sending this information off to the listener, but the primary web service doesn't necessarily know what happened. There's no, like, this is sort of a fire and forget it kind of deal. So while you could now integrate that, like, the action isn't going to, we're going to take this action and send it back to the web service. Webhooks by design are kind of, again, this fire and forget it thing. So we don't necessarily even know that the event payload was received at all. It's just sending it off into the ether. But we can get a lot more complex with that. And what I tend to see happen today is you inject something called an integration broker. A few popular integration brokers, and one is what we'll be looking at a little bit today. One of them that's more known in like home automation is IFTTT. This stands for if this, then that. It's really, again, popular in home automation, supports a lot of IoT device type things. Make is, if you've ever heard of Integromat, it's now called Make. So that's another really widely supported one. We're going to be looking at Microsoft Power Automate, which is part of their like Power Tools, Power BI, used to be known as Microsoft Flow. And another one that I see often, we're not going to look at this today, but I felt worth mentioning, is Zapier. So integration brokers essentially act as this like middleware. So we have that same process that triggers an event. It gets sent to your integration broker. And so that integration broker is now a triggered flow. We're going to do some type of processing. We might even query a third-party service. So maybe this is something like, this event happened here, like we're seeing a slowdown happen, and here's the location. We're now going to look at any third-party service and say, like, is there any known accident there already? And then we can send that and make a decision based on that. Based on that decision, maybe we're going to send that back and like update the web service that we started with. Maybe we say like that it didn't match anything, so we're just going to go straight to end. The nice part of integration brokers like this is you can kind of abstract these individual services, which helps a lot with like forwards and backwards compatibility. Maybe today we're using Survey123 to crowdsource some user input, but eventually Qualtrics might be the more appropriate tool. The idea being we can essentially switch this stack, provide the same set of trigger or like the same endpoint for the trigger, and not have to re-architect this whole stack. So without rebuilding everything, we can feasibly switch things out pretty easily and not like have to re-architect everything. Here we go. So today we're going to be talking about webhooks in ArcGIS specifically, or sorry, ArcGIS Online specifically. If you read the developer documentation on webhooks, webhooks for Portal or ArcGIS Enterprise, there's a ton of webhooks that you can do. Unfortunately, ArcGIS Online has a subset of those available. So really these mostly focus around either Survey123 specifically or feature services. I'm actually going to take this, we're going to jump over to, I'm going to pass it off to Karen a little bit right at this point, as so she has an example based with around Survey123, and I think this is kind of ideal time to switch into that. So Karen, I think I can switch this over to you right now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can talk about a couple things. First of all, so I work at Global Affairs. I know I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, but so I've been at UC Davis for well over 20 years. I guess it's going on 30. And I worked for many years as a, my cat is opening my door. Sorry, lots of noise in the background. Anyway, I've been at Davis for quite some time. And my background is in GIS. So I'm coming at it from kind of the other angle. So I am a longtime GIS user. However, I am not a programmer, and I fell into webhooks when I had a specific case that I needed to solve. And that was that I created a Survey 123 instrument for outside people for Global Affairs, where I work now. I direct something called Global Professional Programs. One of the things we needed to do was to let people let us know that they wanted to come to UC Davis for a tour. Like they're coming from an outside institution and they want us to, you know, introduce them to some people. They're bringing a delegation and we want to do some sort of visit. So that's what you see sort of on this. This is actually a dashboard screenshot that Carlos has on the screen right now. And this is automated. This dashboard is automated when people enter into the survey. However, as Carlos was saying in sort of the workflow, you don't want to have to keep checking back to see when something new has been submitted, because we need to prepare. So if somebody submits a request for a visit, we need to, you know, make all sorts of connections, talk to people, decide if we have rooms reserved, all those kinds of things. So my task was to, first of all, put together the survey, but then as that it became more evident that we needed to have an email sent out every time a survey was submitted. So I will show sort of that example, and I will show you how I created a webhook. And then Carlos, are you going to give the example that you had as well? Yeah, so I'll give a quick one of sort of what I did. I think Carlos is going to then give an example of what he has put together. His is a bit more sophisticated than mine. And then if we have time, we can go through and kind of do a short exercise together to just test this out and try it. So I will go ahead and share my screen here for a moment. Although let me just get the right thing up. One sec, please. It's always this various okay. I will share my screen. Okay, is that, yeah, I think that's showing up.
Yep.
So this is the visitor request form that so just to give you a little bit of the workflow here, this had been created in Qualtrics. And again, when they actually had some sort of an automated email that happened to one person, but that person left and then they no longer had access to the form. And so we were sort of stuck with a survey that nobody could get into the back end, and it was kind of a mess. So I took the questions for that survey and created a Survey 123 instrument with all that information. So this is just briefly what it looks like. We're just asking them various information about what's needed. There is an upload that is mandatory. So they have to add a document of who's coming, like bios of the people that are coming to visit. And I mention that now because that's another piece that I added through webhooks, such that when an email gets sent to me, it also attaches this document. So that was kind of something I figured out. And again, this is me figuring out stuff that is more second nature to Carlos, but it is possible to read blogs and to get, you know, Google things, and that's how I figured a lot of this out. Okay, so it gets all the way down to the bottom, and then it basically you say submit. Now, when you say submit, this comes to let me just show you an example of the email that I get, and it's from me. Are you seeing this on the screen? The
Yep.
email? Okay. So I get an email. I also send it to the person who initially sent me the request, and then a couple of other people. I will say there's also a couple of BCCs in here, so you can have people that don't show up in the when this email goes out. So this is all stuff I set up, including the specifics. And so this is these bolded parts are parts that I added, and then I grabbed the content from the survey that was submitted, that individual record, and fill in all the rest of this. So this is what the person entered, everything that's not in bold. So about the requests that they want. So all of that was formatted in the email section of the webhook. And then, like I said, it has the attachment that is the bios of those people. So one little thing that I note here is that these people also, they enter the date of the request, but I also have a hidden question that grabs the actual date. So we have actually had people try to say they submitted it earlier than they did because they're supposed to give 6 weeks notice. So that was an interesting thing to note, that there's the date of the request that they say, and then there's the actual date that they requested it. So that was one thing that I also set up a hidden question, which I think Carlos will talk a little more about hidden questions as well, which can be really useful. So that's sort of the workflow that I needed, was to be able to have the survey, close that. So the survey itself, and then have it send that email, not just to me, because I don't actually, it's not part of my workflow, but it's my colleagues. And they needed to have that list of the bios. And so then it also populates a dashboard, and that dashboard is also part of what's a building, something called Experience Builder that's been built. So this is all kind of trying to be integrated. What I will show you then is for this particular survey form. So those of you that are, here's how the survey is put together. So if you know anything about Survey 123, hopefully this is relatively straightforward. If you don't, we'll go through an example of how to create a Survey 123 form in a moment. So, you click and drag these things and bring them over, but the important part is, you have to make sure, that you're sharing the survey with the public or members of the UC Davis, and they have to log in, but you have to make sure sharing is enabled. And then the key part is under settings up here, which is where you have webhooks. So notice that it has a webhook indicated here when it was last modified, which was in July. So it's been running for quite some time without problems, thank goodness. So the webhook is entered here. Now, Carlos, this is a quick question for you. When I click add webhook, it now asks me a bunch of questions that I have to input information, and I didn't remember doing that before. So that's one thing we might have you share a bit about when you talk about what you did. So if we go to the Power Automate piece of this, you can log on to Power Automate through your let's just go back here. So you can log on to Power Automate, and then you can, let's go out of this. You can have cloud flows, etc., but you basically start by creating a new flow. I'm going to just edit the one that I just showed you. If we look at that, you can see that, see, I don't know why it has an error. That's a bit weird because it's actually working. But you can then edit the flow and actually set how that's going to work. So you can create a new flow. You can search under survey 123, and you can see that there's connectors and templates. I have just used connectors, so I think the template just sticks it together a little bit more. And if you create a template, you kind of sign in, and I'm already signed in. And then it sort of says, okay, you're going to use Office 365 for the email side of it. You're going to use a survey, you continue, and then you set up the various parameters. And again, this is this error that I'm getting that Carlos is going to have to help me with. You should be able to choose your survey from a list. And my surveys are all here. You pick the survey, and then you decide who you send the email to. So this is just an example of how that template is sort of set up for you. Carlos, did you have anything to add?
Could you choose one of the surveys and just so we can see like what
Yeah, sure.
the
So the one
fields
that's,
past
the
look like?
yeah, so the test I did was Webhooks test survey. And, then you can type in who, so I can say, well, I want this to send a message to myself. Subject, survey submitted. And the body of it, this is where you can actually add dynamic content. It's not allowing me to do it at the moment. And again, not sure why. So, but this is where you can, in the body, you can add the specific information that comes from the individual survey, as I showed you that I had done for the visits and delegations that are coming. So it pulls out each of the specific items that were submitted by that survey to be embedded in the email.
Yeah, typically under that dynamic content section, there would be a label for each field, some things like the ID, the submitter, but they're basically labels that you could drag into and have dynamic content within the body or wherever you're actually putting it in here.
Yeah, and again, I don't know why this wasn't working today, so I'm going to actually get some help from Carlos, but he can also show you some of his that are working. Because I think he's got a great overall example of something that he put together. So again, this is showing you from me, a very amateur when it comes to not understanding webhooks. I was able to put together the one that is still working, the one about for UC Davis for the survey that we created for visits and delegations. Again, something has changed here. So it's giving me, when I save, it's telling me I have to do a URL for ArcGIS Enterprise, which doesn't make sense to me. So in any case, we'll come back and try to fix that. This is a good example of how, in the real world, little things crop up, you have to fix. Okay. So I think with that, I will stop my share. And Carlos, did you want to show your example?
Sure. Let me introduce something first, and then we'll go to that example. Just because, again, I talked about like the integration brokers. We saw that a little bit with Karen's example, but the point being, this is just a example of a few of the different primary integration brokers and the other like connections that you kind of end up working with. So I think this, here's my pointer. If I remember right, this one in the middle here is IFTTT. And so you see things like it can type. I did not choose the best screenshot because I don't know any of these services actually. But I know like Fitbit, for example, like Fitbit's one of the IFTTT ones. And my Nest thermostat, for example, is one of them. So you can basically start to see like there's these different web services that you can either have triggering events or actions based in. And the real kicker that I'm showing here is like you start to see that some of the integration brokers are focused more on a particular set. So I start to see Make doing a lot of things with like, I mean, honestly, they all kind of do social media, but there's a bit more integrations with like social media and like productivity platforms that I see with Make. Explore tends to be things that I would use at my house or my personal life. So we're looking at Power Automate. Power Automate is very obviously it's a Microsoft platform, so it's like very tied into all the Microsoft services. So it knows who you are, but because you logged in and created this. But the nice thing with Power Automate is at least within a business, you can actually share these. Like, so I can say like I can create something for Karen or for Global Affairs and say like I'm going to share it with the group that exists in our organization that is Global Affairs, and now like they have access to that whole back end of it and like they can all design. Whereas like these tend to be more like for individuals use. This is definitely more of an organizational or enterprise use. So again, that's kind of why we're using it. And again, because we already have Office 365, it's something included in our license. So yeah, I talked about, and we just talked about surveys 1, 2, 3 a little bit, but I just wanted to point out what can be done with feature layers. Really, there's a set of events that can be used. So I have a list here. Basically, we can trigger on features created. So features really are like in feature services, they are a record essentially. So this might be a point or a line or something like that, but it is a single feature. So we can trigger on features that have been created, features updated, deleted, edited, which I'm not honestly quite sure what the difference between edited and updated were. We can trigger on attachments. So if attachments are made, created or added or removed. And then the other big one that we haven't used anything from this, but I can see there being use cases is schema changes. So like it might be like if your schema changes, then some downstream event or some downstream processing of yours might break. So being able to be notified when something changes, like I can see that there's a lot of good use of that. So you can trigger on layer definitions changed, schema changes. Again, this is the subset of ArcGIS Online. For enterprise, if you were running your own thing, you could basically trigger on anything that happens, because essentially you can put up your own code at some point. So that said, we're going to walk through a recent example that I worked with Strategic Communications and the CEPB Alumni Association for. So obviously we just were middle of February, we just passed Valentine's Day. So a couple months ago, I was working with CEPB Alumni Marketing, and they have in the past owned this like campaign that they do with really for the whole campus, but it's like really focused on largely alumni and basically gathering story experiences around UC Davis so that they share the love, essentially. So in past years, I've seen that they've done this with Google Forms and essentially taking that Google Forms, putting into a sheet and then displaying the sheet in Google Maps, which is, it's all well and good, but Google Maps is pretty limited. And like, essentially this showed as a pin with some numbers in it that like didn't seem particularly meaningful. And I was like, well, I think we could do something better in way of storytelling, and like a big thing for ArcGIS right now is their story maps. So I'm like, I think we can take this whole workflow and integrate it within the ArcGIS platform. So that's what we're going to take a look at a little bit as our demo case today. And so at that point, we're not looking at slides anymore. We're going to be walking through the actual flow of things. As soon as this loads, can somebody confirm that you can actually see my web pages now?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So I mentioned that CEPB Alumni Association is the group that actually like owns this project. So we're kind of working off of their site. This is the banner of it. So it became a pretty popular thing. I think it actually just got mentioned from the chancellor last week. So I'm like, kind of cool seeing that GIS can be part of storytelling for a wider audience than just GIS people. So it started off they have their social media people are essentially making calls in a number of their different communications channels, but mostly like Twitter, Instagram, sort of such, and just saying like, okay, we're looking for your stories. We're looking for you to share like why you love UC Davis, or if you found love in UC Davis. So we started this off and essentially sent them to, similar to what we saw with Karen, a surveys 1, 2, 3 form. I'm talking while typing and that doesn't work out very well. Which we embedded within one of the alumni groups web pages. And I think they actually took that page down, but believe me that it's in there somewhere. We're going to actually take a look at it within survey 1, 2, 3 and basically tell you the challenge that we're trying to address. I think since we passed Valentine's Day, they're no longer taking new submissions, so they probably turned that page off. But essentially they got a less branded, more integrated version of this survey form. So we asked them, we're trying to like not focus entirely on just like couples stories being inclusive of like there's lots of things to love about Davis. And so like we're gathering lots of different types of stories. So we asked them some basic questions. This is really based on, similar to like what Karen said, we took what they had in Google Forms and like modified it to be a little bit more storytelling than like just forms. But the main thing, like why it's a GIS project, is here. Like, where does your story begin? This is where we're getting, like, where are we putting something on the map? So they get to drop their pin. And again, this is the nice thing of this is like it's a native like geography tool rather than, I think before they were telling them to go to Google Maps, copy out and lat long coordinates and then paste it into a field. So that just, it's messy and not very easy to do on mobile. This is all, again, that idea of modern GIS, it's mobile web first. So nothing too special here. We gathered pictures, but the things that I want to kind of point out here is like we wanted something where we can actually, something that we can actually use for symbology. So the story types and the relationships is one of them, but the graduation year, which is these in here, actually help us in storytelling because that's something like measurable and quantifiable. The where we actually actually needed something for webhooks was there's two things in here. One, a limitation of surveys 1, 2, 3 that I actually didn't know before this project is while you can put multiple map type questions in here, because what's happening here is it's taking your answers and throwing it into a feature service, and kind of by definition, a feature record can only have one geography assigned to it. So while we can put this second map question in here, it doesn't save anywhere. So if we actually click on this, I think it'll tell us something like that. If we go down here, so we have it turned like do not answer. If I say do not answer, it's going to be like, you can only put one of them in here for one point of geometry. So how do we handle multiple map questions? Our answer here was kind of what, again, what Karen was talking about, is we did hidden questions. So we took something from here and ran a calculation for the hidden questions and basically extracted lat, extracted long. So we're not too far off of what they were doing with Google Forms, but we still need somewhere to put that. And in order to put that, we probably don't want it in the same feature service as our original, because these are answers to different questions. We don't want the same geometry showing on the same layer. So the challenge here was one, that we wanted to be able to take this and put it into a separate feature service. And that's where webhooks kind of came in. The other challenge here is like, obviously, since this is a public campaign, we don't really want that going live. Like, what if somebody uploads like inappropriate pictures, or, I mean, just like text that's not, like, we don't want that as the face of UC Davis. So we wanted to add an approval process in here. So we're going to jump now from surveys 1 to 3 and see this was submitted, and we'll look at webhooks, the second part of the webhooks a bit later, but see the feature service that this created. We created a couple of groups with different levels of permissions for each of these like products. We're going to look at the creators, which is really where the feature services live. And we're looking for our feature layers. So does it say hosted somewhere? I'm fairly sure it's this one. We're going to take a look at it. But those others are actually like views of the same service, or like filtering out certain information and displaying it slightly differently. So we are, yes, we're on the hosted feature layer. So what we did was we added an additional field that's not part of survey 1, 2, 3. That was essentially this approval field. That way, when we created a view, we can filter on only submissions that were approved, but there has to be a kind of a workflow for approval. So what we did is something similar to Karen is when a record was submitted, we kicked off an email to our set of moderators within Stratcom and Cal-Ag alumni that said, like, we have this new submission, somebody needs to go review it. So we're going to pop back over here. So similar to what we saw with Karen, we're going to see a couple webhooks already defined in here. But where I think, Karen, you had said you don't remember putting anything in there is when we're using these like integration brokers, or basically like anything that's these like no code solutions, we don't actually have to create the webhooks ourselves. Those integration brokers are what actually create it for us. So yes, while we can do this and we can send that information anywhere, I can write my own application that takes care of it. The idea with the integration brokers is it's like done for us. So I don't really ever put anything in here.
Right, when you create it in Power Automate, it automatically shows up here because you've selected this survey as the one that's part of that process.
Yeah, that's right. All right, so we're now going to jump over to Power Automate. This is probably the most similar to, I mean, this is the similar part to what Karen had done. So we're going to look at our already defined flow. I am seeing the same thing as you, Karen. I
don't feel so bad now. Like, why are we getting that weird? Yeah.
Yeah, I do not know, but we can work through that. But since this one's already written, we can see a few of the survey response attributes that are in that body. Again, normally it would be right here, and I literally ran this yesterday and like recreated it yesterday and it worked.
I have to say, Carlos, this makes me feel like I'm not quite as much of an idiot as I thought I was. So I don't know what happened either. But you know, the funny thing is, I had one of them worked. It worked today, so I had that submission today. So even though it says cannot read properties, it's working. So I don't know.
So really, what this is it's trying to pull schema. So it's trying to like query the survey 1, 2, 3, see what fields are returned in that survey. And so that I can like build a schematic and then create dynamic content. I think we can actually take a look at this and they'll already be defined. This is not supposed to be super readable, but actually even less than I thought. Oh, ignore that. But, yeah, we'll try recreating the connection and see what's going on. But yeah, so this is really similar. This is just sending something off to, I mean, right now this is my example one, but it's sending to me and the Cal-Ag alumni folks, and just says that they submitted, and it includes essentially the story section of this. We didn't actually do attachments because we're putting in like lots of photos and that could have gotten big really quickly. We had a few hundred submissions. But what that tells them, and there's a link in there that leads them to another product that we created. I'm going to jump back into groups. And this managers group is essentially our moderators. So the moderators had access to this like quick web app builder app that it created, which allowed them to go through and like moderate the content. So if there was one that hadn't been submitted yet, it'd have a list of that hadn't been reviewed yet, they'd have a list there. But since the submissions are closed, we're not seeing any of the old ones, but essentially like they get a list of records, they be able to click on the record, review it, see the pictures that were uploaded as part of it, and if everything looks good, this started off as not reviewed. They had the opportunity to approve or reject. If it was approved, it then ends up in the final product, which is part of a set of story maps. And just because I want to, I'm going to show that off a little bit. But again, because it's kind of part of that same workflow, and all these webhook things are about workflow. And then this, you can actually, we'll be able to take a look at the two different feature services that power maps that I had talked about earlier. So we're not going to walk through the entire product. How's that? But essentially should not use that. Okay, I did not pray to the demo gods, I'm sorry. Oh, no, okay. So once a feature or a record was approved, it now shows up on this public map, along with the rest of the submission. But it ends up being in a few other places within the story. What I wanted to actually show is the second part of this was the second webhook that we haven't looked at yet, is I wanted that second map question to show up in an additional feature service, but only after it's been approved, right? So this is the idea, this idea of like, this is where their story started, and then now this is where they are now. So just trying to show the reach of folks at from UC Davis and their story, the end of the story, I guess, or the current part of their story. So part of that, we wanted to be able to fire off a second webhook once something was hit as approved. So that's not talking about that features updated event. So we're going to jump back into our Power Automate, and this probably will have that same issue, but we'll see. So while there's the Survey 123 connector, there's also an ArcGIS connector, and we'll take a look at what those each can do. But while these connectors are kind of like the easy way to do it, the webhooks, again, they're this common concept. We could actually build the same products that we're doing here without utilizing like pre-configured connectors. I can create a webhook endpoint and say, like, whenever something hits this endpoint, trigger this flow. And that's actually how I used to do it. Like 2 years ago, these things didn't exist, and I was still using webhooks at that time because the technology was there. They just didn't have these connectors already in place. These, I think, will still work. It always takes a long time whenever I load them, but we're going to take a look at what. So the webhook, I think we saw it here as well. The second webhook in here. Oh, actually, I'm kind of twisting things together, but let's just say the second webhook in here equals what's being fired to this flow. But not actually. So we're seeing like a feature changed. So that was somebody going in and saying it is now approved. So this was me selecting like what feature service I'm actually watching for changes. It receives let's take a look at one of the examples, and that might make it a little bit clearer. So these are some of them that I was running yesterday as an example. So this should actually let me like replay past submissions. I was trying to create an actual like demo example for this, but the webhook fires, we receive an event that says this service changed, and it gives us a link back to what were those change, what changes were made. So we received that kicks off. Important to note that like it kind of groups these together. Within the webhook, you can define how often it's going to group things together. So maybe I don't want, if this is a really popular service, I don't want it firing like 10 in 1 second. I'm going to group them together after 20 seconds. So it's going to send me a batch of whatever happened within those 20 seconds. So it's not quite polling, but it's like this pseudo, we're going to still only run so often. So because it could be grouped, we're going to have this apply each that goes along with it. And really in this case, there was only one. So it received the event, it sent me a changes link. I'm now querying that link. It gives me back like what layer that was from, and then the layer ID. So I guess in the feature service, you can have multiple layers, and then the items that changed. So in this case, it was just me making a change. I think I changed and like approved it. But it will give me all the information about that item or that record that changed. So it includes the geometry and any attributes that go along with that. I can now then do something with this. So this is me talking about putting something back into ArcGIS, but it could be just as easily. Maybe I want to send an email. Maybe I want to pump it something through an AI model. We ran a different project where like every time somebody submitted a picture, it ran through an AI model, then identified what it was, and then put that back into the feature service and said, okay, there was a lion roadkill here. Probably not a lion, but nice example. So then this is saying, I want to now put it into, note these feature layers don't match. So I'm putting the geography from this into a new feature layer. And I think that if pop in here, it'll let us see what, yeah. So I took the geometry from that initial submission and put it into a new feature layer. And so that was essentially what we were doing with the ArcGIS in Love thing, is like we were taking that second map question, taking the geography from it when it was approved, and then putting into the where now feature service. Okay, so that's not confusing enough. That is essentially my example, but I'm going to provide us a quick, like we're going to walk through creating one of these together. So I'm going to give you a link quickly and like have you go through that for a couple minutes on your own, and then we'll walk through it together and experience, like see if we're seeing the same problems that that Karen and I had to begin with. And I'll kind of work through that alongside. I lost my notes window. Okay, so I'm going to drop a link into chat. And now you were correct. That's the link that I was looking for, but I did not see chat at all at that time. All right, so that is the example. Note that this actually has a few different sections. I talked about make, which used to be Integromat. Again, we're using Power Automate in my examples, but maybe make doesn't have this this problem right now. Make is actually a really cool tool. I have a couple groups within UC Davis that were using it because Make was actually, I think that they do their development in Make first and then Power Automate. So it had some of the newer features initially that are now supported in both. But so I'm going to leave you that, and we're going to come back in 10 minutes. But while we're doing that, I'm going to work through on screen and see if we can create a new connection and not experience the problem that Karen was going with. Do we have any questions at that stage before I let you guys go for a little bit?
I mean, I'd like to hear if anyone, is interested in actually using these and maybe what your use case might be. Again, I have found just the knowing that someone submitted a survey. Another thing that I use it for is when I have a different group of Humphrey Fellows that come every year, and I send them a survey so I can kind of, they sort of get to know them before they come to the United States for 10 months. And there's only like 10 or 12 of them. So I send out the link, and I want to know each time one of them has actually submitted their response to that survey so I can kind of go in and read up on them. and again, as that, I love that diagram that Carlos put at the very beginning, where he's like, the old way was you just have to check, did something change? No. Did something change? No. Did something change? No. And with the webhook, it just gives you that trigger that says somebody submitted, and then I can go look. So any thoughts, any questions? While I know Carlos is making sure everything works.
All right, so why don't we say we're gonna come back at this at like 3:10, and I will kind of work through some of this as an example prior to that.
That sounds good. Do you want me to pause the recording, like if we're working on our own? Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be good.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and pause it, but remind me to turn it back on.
Okay, I will.
All right, we'll be back in, what'd you say, 10 minutes?
Yeah, 3:10.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we're back and Carlos is going to walk us through some of the reading we've just been doing.
So I may not follow exactly the reading because we actually need to start a little bit before that. But let me share my screen again. And so this is the page that I had shared out earlier. But in order to actually do anything with this, we actually need to create a survey to put the webhook to. So we're going to start at, let's just go to surveys 1, 2, 3. We're going to create a very basic survey with almost nothing in it, but just something to work off of. Sign in. I think I should already be signed in, but and no, I don't own that much stuff. Okay. So we're gonna say new survey. We're just gonna do a blank survey, and we'll add like 2 questions in there just so we can see that there are attributes getting passed. So let's say a single line text and then your name. And then we'll add an email address. And yeah, so we're not going to really do anything other than like save this and publish it.
And of course, normally you give your survey a name and all those other things. This is super, super basic. That's great. Keep it simple. And it still takes it forever to publish. There we go.
Yeah, no kidding. All right. And just for continuity, we're going to take a look at that webhook section that we started out with. And notice there are no webhooks.
Nothing. Yeah.
So we're not going to go through the wizard from here. Again, this would be useful if you're like trying to connect it with a customer service or something that you're written or hosted yourself. All right, so now we're going to jump over to Power Automate. I know it's just that, but like, let's find it, say Power Automate. Oh, just kidding. Just remember, it's make it at powerautomate.com. But yeah, if you search Power Automate, it'll bring you to some splash page that doesn't look, it looks like a marketing site. There is a sign in somewhere there, and you should be able to sign in with any Office 365 account. I know that our Office 365 accounts include the premium connectors, which isn't necessary for the Survey 1, 2, 3 webhooks, but it is necessary for the ArcGIS feature services webhooks. But most higher ed should have licensing for that. I already have this created a number of times, but I'm going to go through this real quick anyways. So you're going to start off and go to this data section and hit connections. And this is kind of what we saw earlier in my presentation, just like a list of all the different services that it can integrate with when it finally loads. And clearly survey 123 is probably not the most popular integration that they do here. So we're going to have to filter through it a little bit. But do. So notice like I have a lot of things in here already. And somehow every time I run through a demo of this, like I get another survey 123
I
connection.
know.
They're essentially the same thing. And I should probably, I don't even know if I could rename them, but yeah, we're going to do it one more time. All right, so we're going to hit new surveys, or sorry, new connection. And this is all of those that I was talking about before. So it can kind of tie in like most web-based business systems. But like I said, we're only looking at survey 123 for now. So we're going to filter, say surveys. I've done some stuff with like SurveyMonkey as well. Honestly, like the survey 123 integration or connector is pretty basic by comparison to a lot of the others. So yeah, take that for what it is. We're going to create the connection. And it pops up a little. I don't know if it'll actually show me anything since I'm already signed in there. Okay. So normally it would like pop you to ArcGIS Online and have you sign in and everything. I'm already signed in. So I'm really just allowing it to use my identity and access my records on behalf of, so that this can continue to operate on behalf of my account, even if I'm not at the controls. So we're saying allow, and that will create one more. I don't know what the prefix was, but now I have one more survey 123 connection. But that's what we're going to have to use for the actual flows. So then we're going to jump over to create. Power Automate does actually have some desktop client stuff. So there's different types of flows that you can do. We're going to do something that's entirely in the cloud. So we're going to say automated cloud flow. I usually skip this just because it's easier to jump right in and work, but you can start naming your things here. I always hit just skip. And yeah, you're essentially going to get the same options, just in a nicer window here. So we're going to utilize the survey 123 connection that we already set up. I'll say surveys, find that, and note that when I talked about webhooks earlier on, those processes basically always begin with a trigger and end with an action. So some of these connectors have both. Some of them are only triggers. So I think, yeah, there's a couple other things that we can do with it, but right now we're starting with just like what starts off the flow. So we're going to say the webhook that we're connecting to, that event is when a survey response is submitted. So I'll hit that. It is now like, because I've already set up the connection, it should be able to query surveys that I've already set up, and note that I didn't title it, so it's not particularly useful, but we know that untitled survey is the one that we had just set up in surveys 123. So we're going to click that. And then, so that is starting off the flow. We're going to add the next step of it. And remember, I had talked a little bit about decision making. That's something like controls. There's other types of decision making that we can do, but let's just put in a condition. And we're going to have some type of comparison that says, if it's true, do this. If it's not, do this. So we're going to say if email is, I'm going to say contains ucdavis.edu. Then we're going to, and this is now the actions phase of it. So just to be simple for now, we're going to say mail. And note, Karen talked a little about a bit before, like you could use Gmail if you don't have a 365, but there are kind of like infinite possibilities on like what different connectors you can do. Where I'm going to use this mail one just because it doesn't require any additional setup. I don't have to log in, create another connector to Gmail, for example, because it already knows me as logged into Office 365. But if you didn't want it to send as you, for example, you'd probably want to use one of these other ones. So we're going to hit mail, and the action is send an email. We're going to, in this case, I'm going to put my address. But maybe we also want to use the email address that was included in our form, which is right there. So that's, you know, that's what it's talking about when we say dynamic content. It's like we don't know what this value is going to be yet, but it will fill it in along the way. And let's just for a good measure, we're going to say like who submitted it as the subject line, and then content is the your name attribute. I'm trying to decide like what would I do if it wasn't a UC Davis address. Or in this case, I'm just going to let it go away and say like if it's not a UC Davis address that's submitted, we're not going to do anything with it. So we hit save. Note at this point, while we've saved the flow, I don't believe it's active yet. So, oh, just kidding. Oh, in any case, there's generally a turn on or turn off here. You could basically like disable the flow wall so that the webhooks are still firing from survey 1, 2, 3. It reaches Power Automate. And again, I talked about before, like we're just sending this off into the void. The web service that initiates it doesn't necessarily need to know that anything happened with it. If we had this turned off, it would just like not do anything with the information once it's received. But we're going to jump back over to surveys 1, 2, 3, and if we refresh this page, we should now see a webhook was added. There we go. And no, it did all the heavy lifting for us. It set up the endpoint for the webhook. That it, like I said, we could actually create this all on our own without really doing any of this. What we could do is if we wanted to like hold back some of the information, maybe I don't want to send like who the submitter was to a third-party service. So you could customize the payload here. I'm not really going to handle that right now, but I just wanted to point it out. So we should now be able to actually try it out and see what happens. Where do I get my link?
It's that little three-pronged.
Thank you.
There you go.
All right, so our live published version of survey 1, 2, 3. And I'm just going to say Carlos Barahona and I don't know. Yeah. Submit. And the cool thing with like Power Automate versus some of the others, you can actually kind of see this in progress. So it should pop up in a moment when it actually receives the webhook. There it is. And so we can see the run history. So it was received when I hit submit, and we can actually pop through and like see what information was received. This is really helpful when troubleshooting, but it's also really helpful when developing. So maybe I want to add things along the way and like see what information is passed through to each step. So we like maybe the condition wasn't evaluating as I expected, so I can actually see like, okay, it ran and like the result was false. Well, then I got to figure out why it was false. I did it wrong in that I think I had seen this at the time. I did not put that little semicolon between my static code and my dynamic content, but let's just pretend that worked. So that's our basic example from the doc that I had sent you guys. But I wanted to see if you guys are interested in looking at doing the same thing with feature services, like looking at the feature services updated webhooks. Is that something like it? Is that helpful to people? It's more complicated.
I think it's helpful.
Okay.
But why don't I pause? I mean, you went pretty fast. Does anyone get stuck along the way, or anyone have any questions based on the process we just went through? And Carlos, I think my error was I was trying to use a template that just went straight to Office 365, and there's some weird thing that wasn't working. So interesting, you did a little different than I did, which is you just started with survey 1, 2, 3, and then you added the condition. Whereas I was just, I guess I wasn't specifically putting a condition because I thought it was in the template. So maybe that's.
You don't have to put a condition. I just wanted to provide it as an example of like that decision-making part that I had talked about earlier.
Right. And then you add the mail part behind. Yeah. So you put it kind of between the survey and the mail part. So you could do the same thing, I guess. Just one thing, which is what I was trying to do, is that you can add it using an existing connector or a template, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Templates are essentially like we know lots of people do this same
Right.
flow. So lots of people take and make an email notification out of a survey 1, 2, 3 submission. This seemed pretty basic to me, so I don't usually work off templates. Yeah,
well, and interestingly, that's what was failing for me. And when I just followed through with you on this one, it worked fine. So something's up maybe with that.
Yeah, well, could
be.
Okay, we will jump to the feature service webhooks. So I am going to clean up my window a little bit just because I have a ton of stuff opened, and we'll reopen things as necessary. Okay, we don't need survey 1, 2, 3 anymore, but we're going to go straight to ArcGIS Online. Back out to home here. So something that's important to note to begin even talking about this is webhooks within feature services, kind of a couple conditions, but mainly that feature, I think it's called feature editing is enabled, or editing tracking is enabled. And that's essentially how it determines what has changed. And so like what it's sending on to the webhook. So we are going to start off. I already have a feature service that I had set up for this demo, but we're just going to walk through where that change was made. All right, so this is just a test feature service. If you guys want to follow along, all this was saying new item, feature layer, and yeah, essentially I created with default or the default options. So we're creating this hosted feature service, which has in ArcGIS Online, that's a feature layer. But I keep saying feature service. I'm going to kind of show you. At the end of the day, ArcGIS Online is really a ArcGIS server running with a nice web front end. That is actually the feature service. If we wanted to pop that in, actually it might not. I'm not authenticated here, so I would have to get a token and stuff. But if this was a public feature service, it would show up here automatically. In order to make this work, we need to make sure that editing tracking is turned on. So we're hitting settings, and we're going to scroll down, and these are basically the three. Actually, I think it's even just the first two options that matter. So what it's doing is using that change log to determine what changes were made. So yeah, we're going to pop back to overview, and in order, like for Power Automate, much in the same way, like with when we looked at service 1, 2, 3, we didn't add the webhook here, but you could if you were doing like your own custom application that like doesn't have these connectors already built in. I'm going to quickly show you where that would be. So we're looking at this the feature service, we would look at admin, and you have these like webhook section. I think I already created a webhook, so it's there, but normally you would hit webhooks, create, and this is like that raw info that you're putting in there. I talked a little bit about the interval, like if I wanted it to evaluate, only group things together by a second, I could say 1 second there. And we can define like exactly what events we want it to trigger on. Maybe I want it to trigger on features updated, but I don't want it to trigger on features created. You could put that in here, but Power Automate should set this all up for us. So I'm not going to go too into anything here. The one thing that I will point out, we're not going to talk about it today, but I will have a note to talk about this later, is this thing called a signature key. This is essentially so that you can make sure that only the services that you want talking to each other are talking to each other, and you can't like impersonate a web service. So you create this key that goes kind of in both sides that gets compared more or less. Again, for something simple like this, it's kind of overkill, but I just wanted to tell you what that is. All right, so we'll close that. And we're going to jump back over to Power Automate. So Power Automate, similar to when we added the Survey 123 connector, there's another connector called ArcGIS Online. Actually, connections. All right, everything's loading slow for me today. All right. Similar before, I actually already have this set up, and I tested it like earlier this morning, so it's probably got a recent modified date. But we're going to start this new connection, search ArcGIS. There's actually two. This is the one, like this one's for, I think we can do like geocoding and some enrichment services. So this is not interacting with my data. This is interacting with like my things that are in my account as ArcGIS Online. These are more about services. I forgot what P stands for, PSS. But in any case, so we're going to create. I popped up that same window that we saw before. Gonna authenticate me into our ArcGIS Online. If I hadn't already been logged in, maybe let's see what it would normally look like. So you normally get to the normal ArcGIS Online login screen. I have a ton of logins, so it's pre-populating, but we're just going to look at my organizational account. And then we're logging with my Kerberos, and I should already be, yeah, single sign-on makes things easy. I don't have to type anything in right now. Again, we saw that click X, and I don't know what that was about. But it connected. So I think we're good for now. So we'll say create. Again, automated cloud flow. And we're going to search ArcGIS. And so note before with Survey 123, we only had a single web hooked up act on, which was survey submitted. We get a bunch here. And these are those same like events that I talked about before. So we could have it trigger on all of them. But typically you'd want like a different flow, like if something was created versus if something was updated, you'd want to handle things differently. For our purposes here, I'm going to actually use the when record is created. That said, I wanted to show we can actually use this to put information back into ArcGIS Online. So if maybe I got a triggered event when an attachment was added, I want to use some third-party service to normalize or maybe remove EXIF data, something like that, of the picture, and then put it back into ArcGIS Online. This lets us interact with both like information coming from ArcGIS Online and put it back, as well as like query. So in this case, let's say created. This is a worksheet. I was seeing a similar problem to what we saw earlier, Karen. It's not loading a list of my feature services. But what I found is I can actually do this manually. So I'm going to show that trick here. Usually it would show up feature services that have that editing tracking enabled. But what we actually can do is just take this item ID. So it's item ID, layer ID, and I'll copy this into chat. And then the layer number. So in this case, we only have a single layer, so it's layer 0. So we're going to grab that, and I have a note somewhere, so I'll put that. The format. That is the format of what will be the layer ID in our automate. All right, so we've selected that layer. We're now going to say new step, and I'm going to search this again. I talked a bit before about what's actually in the web triggers for feature services a little bit different. It doesn't include all the attributes by default. It includes a URL that has the changes. So we're going to then use that URL and say, fetch the updates and changes from those feature layers. And note that now we get the dynamic content from our first step. So our first step was when a record was created. So these are the two options, or the two attributes that came from that step. We're going to use the changes URL, and it notices like automatically that changes URL, the schema of it has multiple. So it changed it automatically to this apply to each. Remember, I said that they group changes together, or items together in the changes. So it's essentially creating a loop here. We're actually going to take that same layer ID. I could probably pull it from something, but I'm just, because I know things weren't working quite right, I'm just going to paste it in. And then the layer ID here. Note that this feature layer ID is equal to this, whereas feature layer is equal to this whole feature layer service. Right. So this will actually get the changes that happened when this was triggered. So we're going to say our next step. Let's do something with it. So we're going to now take this and run an action. I don't have attachments enabled on that layer. So let's create a record in a new feature. So create a record in a feature layer. And this one does. Yeah, sometimes it works, sometimes I'm not really sure. I could have, again, done that same trick and like put my custom value in and use that feature ID. But let's put it probably none of these places. Let's grab another layer. Let's create a layer. Yeah, so we're going to create a single layer in there and demo destination layer. Okay, and there. I'm going to put it into my favorites because that seems to load. Okay. Yeah, and nothing in here so far. And I'm just kind of showing this as context so that we see when something pops into it later. So let's see if it will do it dynamically. We chose my favorites. And I'm going to delete this real quick and then save and then reload the page and see if it grabs it for us. I don't think I created it. Okay. I am cursed by slow loading today. Yeah, but it's not just ArcGIS Online. I mean, I guess it's creating something there too. That's why you just self-host everything and make it faster. There it goes. Okay. We're going to add an action. Search this again. And create a record and features. Favorites. And there we are, demo destination layer. And we want to give it geometry. I think this is going to be a JSON object. This is really where you're going to have to reference, like, depending what's in your feature service, reference the development documentation, and I can give a link to that in a second. But we're just going to pass it XY values. And what just happened there? Along that. Right. Save. So what should happen now is when I create a feature in the first service, it should fire this webhook and then create this a matching feature in the second service. I'm gonna pop over back to our initial service. And to add a feature, I'm just going to do it in the map editor. And it will drop one in South America. And call it. Oh, right. So all goes well. It should wait up to 30 seconds because that's the interval that we had. That's the default interval. We can shorten that if we want to. But let's see. Again, I forgot to pray to the demo gods, so let's just hope this works. There we go. All right, so it's actually running, which is kind of interesting. Like there is a test that we could run here and see it as it happens. That's kind of interesting as well, but succeeded. If it hadn't, we could actually run through, like I showed you before, and actually see where it failed. But let's just step through and see what happened. And it's probably going to do that slow. Oh, it's loaded quicker this time. So we're actually seeing the name of the flow or the webhook, the service that was updated, when it was fired. And this is the key. Like, this is what we are actually, the only useful information in this webhook trigger is that changes URL. Remember, we're passing that through. Okay, now it is taking a long time. Let's guess that maybe it's making that same query and like it's going to take 12 seconds. Yeah, while it's doing that, let's see if the feature was created in our destination service. Oh, there. All right, so it got the changes. I queried the changes. That's the layer that it looked up, and this is the feature that was changed. And yeah, passed through all that. Sorry, feature that was created, not changed. And then it should have created a new object. So that's our first object. So it's created as object ID 1, created successfully on this layer. So we should be able to go through and see. Our demo destination layer. First, that an object was created. And let's see that it's also in South America. And there it is. So the point here was not really showing a use case. It was showing that you can interact both as like a triggered event from the service and put information, or like query even, but put information back into the service. Realistically, there's probably no point in doing something like exactly like this, but maybe again, you want to pass the information from those feature services changes into a third-party service that like enriches the data. Or one of the things I was looking at is like, for the earlier example of the Aggies in Love, I didn't necessarily want their exact location of like where they are now. So taking something like that and like reverse geolocating and getting the city name, and then maybe I can generalize to the like drop the pin at the city level, rather than like if they accidentally shared, okay, I'm logging in from submitting this from my house. So you're basically like injecting a post-processing like data processing service along the way. So yeah, that's feature services webhooks. Do we have any questions at this point? Like there's really, because there's infinite connections here, there's infinite possibilities on what you could do with it. I'm curious to see like if there's thoughts of like how you would integrate this into some other web workflow.
So I'll pipe up because
Sure.
I'm always willing to talk. So I was having a side conversation with Alex in Slack, and I realized that what you're showing is really similar to GitHub Actions.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So folks who may have done this with GitHub, this is really similar. And I never made the connection because this is called webhooks, and what I was doing is called GitHub Actions. And then all of a sudden I was like, wait, this is the same thing. I mean, not the exact same thing, but very similar. So I'm
fairly sure that GitHub Actions are actually operating on webhooks.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I believe that is true, because you can do things like say, like I've got one that runs like when you push something to the repository, it'll run an R script, for example, and then update some data. So I just want to bring that up in case anyone else was not making that connection until now. Help them along, or admit that I've just like Karen mentioned earlier, feeling like she's a little behind the curve, which she's not, but like I'm suddenly feeling that way myself. It's like, oh yeah, duh, this is something I've been doing. So anyway, anyone else wants to share, there's that.
Where I could actually see this kind of being used is more like field worker type operations. I know that at UC Davis, the grounds crew, or that like the arborists use field maps right now when they go out and like evaluate trees, like after big storms, they go through and like say, okay, this is the damage that we're seeing. So maybe something like when that record is changed, like kicking off it, okay, this needs to be acted upon by like the, I don't know, like there's a difference between like grounds and arborists. Maybe that can like pass off tasks or things like this, but it's just like that ability to act on something more or less real time rather than like batch processing at the end. All right, with that, I am going to leave with, I have a quick slide on a few links that I will actually include in chat as well, but so there's a question from Naomi, can it track data downloads? So my guess is that you're talking about like if somebody exports exports a feature. So no, not online, but again, that is actually something that I'm fairly sure is possible in enterprise. I don't think that there was one. Let me pull up the page that actually that was in my references. So I think, can I? Nope. I'm going to pull up the page that actually details what events are fired in feature services, but I don't believe that's one of them. This is also just a good reference page. This is the same thing that we were seeing earlier, where it's like the changes URL, the event type, and then the IDs that go along with it. But I do not see one for exports, unfortunately. Yeah, actually, that is one of my kind of bigger criticisms of ArcGIS Online is you can't see what, like even if somebody's utilizing your feature that's like published publicly and using it in an application, I can't ever see that like, here's where my data is being used. And I think that's a feature, a request that I've had back to the ArcGIS Online team for quite a while. Because the information is there. I could do it.
Can you get some of that through Google, through setting up Google Analytics?
Not
for this. For story maps, you can.
Yeah.
You were telling me, right, but not not for the other. Yeah.
But again, the information is there because it's in enterprise, it's in ArcGIS Online, in ArcGIS server. It could be done. It's really just them deciding like what's useful to expose to the more general audience. This is the page that I'm showing here is like, it is broken up into like online versus enterprise. It is really interesting to see like the number of things that exist in enterprise that don't in ArcGIS Online, even though they actually under the hood are the same product. I don't know if it will show out. I think I have to like drill down into it, but there's a lot more webhooks that are available in enterprise. So I talked a little bit about the token security thing. Like if that is something that you're using in production, you definitely want to look at security. This was a good blog that like walked through that process. And then the other thing that I really liked, this GitHub. This is about a year old, but it kind of talks about like the different integration brokers and being able to use this customized with your own web service. So this was that as a developer, this is a good service. But let me throw these all into chat real quick and in case you want to do reading later on. All right, that's really all I have. I hope that somebody finds it useful, at least spurs some ideas.
Are there any other questions that we can address in the last couple minutes?
I wanted to just add that when I was at a recent Esri conference, I went to a webhook session. And one of the things I said is, do you have any like lessons for learning how to do this? Because I feel like all of us kind of have to, at least people like me, have to go through blogs and questions and all this. And they did say that they have 3 of their sort of learn.arcgis.com lessons being created that actually teach you webhooks. So stay tuned for that. I suspect it'll be the simpler ones at first, but you know, let's hope that'll also help people get started.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. Whenever I talk about it with somebody, it's like I don't have really anything to point them to learn it. So it's usually a one-on-one. We'll talk about it a little bit.
Well, that makes the session even more important then, because I think this was a really nice introduction to what's available and also some of the pitfalls that are easy to make as a beginner. So thank you both, Carlos and Karen, for this presentation today. I learned a lot and obviously made some mental connections that I hadn't made earlier. So I really appreciate this. I think this will come up a lot now that I know more about it. And I suspect for other folks too. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And thank you, Carlos, for you did the heavy hitting. So thank you very much. Awesome.